Alright, so this PowerPoint we're going to be talking about 19th century thought. We're going to talk about what it means to be European conservative and liberal, and we're going to begin talking about nationalism. We're also going to cover Romanticism, Hegel, Karl Marx, and one of my favorite guys, Friedrich Nietzsche. This picture here it's a painting by William Turner. It's called Slave Ship. And I think we've discussed this before, but what some people would do for the insurance policy is throw people who had died on the Middle Passage overboard and claim them on their insurance. This whole painting is somewhat red and blurry, and as you can see, it kind of emphasizes color over form. William Turner was very well known for these types of paintings. This is kind of a painting that is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, right? Human beings had kind of started to get this idea of dominating them. Man dominates over nature kind of idea. And what William Turner's painting here is just the opposite, right? This is nature dominating man, right? This slave ship, and it's also a moral painting. If you look at it, there's some type of large animal in the sea that's also eating. You can see slaves overboard. The ship's in the background. It's kind of a scary looking painting in a sense. And not only is it morality, but he's also saying humans shouldn't think that they have control over nature, because they do not. Even in today society, we do not. Alright, so we'll talk about the first three isms today. On this slide, the 19th century was a century of isms. We'll get to communism and socialism as well. But first, let's talk about conservatism, liberalism, and nationalism. Now, this is in the European sense. This isn't in the American sense, so there are a few differences. Conservatism in 19th century Europe was all based upon legitimacy. It was there's a direct correlation between what happened with the French Revolution and the conservatism of 19th century Europe. It was based on the legitimacy of the monarch and the hierarchical social order that had run Europe for centuries and centuries, and had created a pretty peaceful continent by the 1700s, and then the French Revolution happened. They believed the monarch created stability, that the nobility were the rightful leaders of the nation, and that they both needed to play an active role in running the government. Edmund Burke, who we talked about in the French Revolution, he opposed all of the ideas of natural rights. The idea of throwing away traditions was against everything that he stood for. History, he was a big history guy. Here's what happened in history, and this is why things. He didn't say things don't need to change. Burke just basically said things have to change slowly, incrementally, and they have to be managed so they can strengthen society's structure and not weaken it, because he says conserving the past and the culture means that you can have an orderly future, and it's not violent at all. So it's kind of different what we believe as conservatives in that sense. They're not violent, and they're very monarchical, and we'll see how liberals kind of turn into what we think of as conservatives today. And you also have to understand that after the French Revolution and how many poor people died from it all, there were a lot of lower class, even middle class people who wanted to go back to this monarchy kind of socially peaceful time. Maybe we do need to give up a few of our rights for peace, kind of what happens after 9/11, right? When people get scared and violence happens, that tends to make them think that giving up their rights is okay for, as long as you can bring stability back. And so that's kind of what conservatism is. It's order, it's tradition, it's peaceful, and it's change, but it's an incrementally slow change. It's not like the French Revolution, where boom, you cut off a king's head and you proclaim a republic in a day. It's not like that. Burke and his fellows believe that church and family, monarchy, nobility, that's tradition, that's what holds the glue to a country together. On the other side of that is liberalism. And liberalism in the 19th century European idea is all about the individual, okay? The individual is everything in society. It was a commitment to human rights, and it was the idea that government was there only to function as a protector of those human rights, as a protector of liberty. And we talked a little bit about Locke and Smith earlier, and it's the idea that of the social contract, right? The government's not there to tell you what to do. The government is there to make sure that you enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what liberals in the 19th century idea think about. This doesn't mean that they're democratic. They still also have this idea that the rich and the educated should still run the country, right? Because the rich people were the educated people. But at the same time, they're saying the individual is at the center of all this. Remember, we talked about how the wealth of nations, when the individual makes a decision that's good for him or her, that will benefit society as a whole. They come up with the idea, Adam Smith also comes up with the idea of free enterprise, and he's very prophetic about globalizations and that differences would start to break down once everybody starts trading with everybody and everybody's open with everybody. Adam Smith kind of prophesies globalization in a sense. And I think we also talked about John Locke. He's more of a guy who talks about humanity in a sense, and individuals need to go out and experience things themselves. And I think we've already talked about him, so we don't need to cover that much. Adam Smith was also somewhat of a socialist as well, because even though he says it is all about the individual, he still believes that the government is there to protect its citizens and supply some public services. He starts talking about the law of economics, supply and demand, balance of trade, law of diminishing returns, right? Things that once you get used to something, you start liking it less and less and less. You know, it's like you get the same ice cream every day. You start wanting a different ice cream. That's Adam Smith's idea. It's called the law of diminishing returns. He really starts putting things in putting an economic emphasis on everything that humans do. Adam Smith is really the first guy who really drives it home that what people really want is to become richer, right? He's an economist in every sense of the word. You also get Malthus, who is also a liberal, and he comes up with the principle of population, which is a bit disconcerting, really, and it'll be used by other people in the future. His principle, and this is a liberal idea in the 19th century, is that there are too many people to feed for the resources that are out there today, or he calls it geometric versus an arithmetic problem, right? There's too many people, not enough food. And he says what that's doing is that's stunting progress. So he says it's impossible to progress in this sense. So his whole argument is if we have to choose somebody to die from malnutrition and from water, since there's already too many people on this planet for food that we can grow and the water clean water that we can drink, then we need to let the people who are uneducated die first, because that is the only way that the world is going to progress, in a sense. So he was not a very well. I mean, when you look back at the time, it wasn't. It was somewhat controversial, this principle of population, but it also took hold with a lot of people. It's very social Darwinist, right? I mean, we kind of skipped over this to get to things fall apart, but this is the beginning of this idea, right? And the third ism that we're going to talk about that really comes out in the 19th century is nationalism. And this is probably the most important one of all of them, because this is what's going to create two world wars, and then the Cold War, and then the world we live in today. And this kind of idea of nationalism really makes strides after the French Revolution. And this is probably hard to grasp, because what really is a nation? Nations are very arbitrary, right? Borders are arbitrary. Why is this part of the Alsace-Lorraine in France and this part in Germany? Ideas like that. Why is Moscow in Idaho? Why is Pullman in Washington? Right? So they're very arbitrary to begin with. So the whole idea of a nation is, it can really fit a lot of things. It comes from, a nation comes from a Latin verb which means to be born, which implies a common birth. So that's kind of the idea. If when it came out, is if you were born in this area, that means you are part of this. You are part of this, what we would consider a nation today. Earlier, before the French Revolution, especially in France and Britain, the aristocracy were what constituted a nation. But then you get the French Revolution, and it makes it the people, and no longer the king as a sovereign, but more like things people were saying during the French Revolution: long live the nation. It becomes a political community, and not so much like a territory or an ethnicity, right? It's not, hey, I speak French, so I'm French. It's this idea, hey, I belong in the same community as you politically. We vote for the same people, or the same person as our governor. That means we're French together. If you speak German and you live there and you're under their control, then you're French. You just happen to speak German. That kind of idea. And then what comes out of this political community is the idea that then you build a state around it, you build an army around it, you build a legal system, and you get what we would consider as a modern state today. And what a modern state today kind of encompasses is legal equality, constitutional governments, unity, things like that. That's what starts popping up for the first time in history, are these ideas that we all belong to the same political community with the same laws. I mean, even though in the Roman Empire and other empires you all had the same law, it wasn't quite the same idea, right? You still weren't Roman, even if you were a Roman citizen. But now you are a French man or a French woman if you're in this community, no matter what, right? It's also this idea of economic modernity. Once these nations start forming themselves, that just gives you more incentive to develop infrastructure, better banking, transportation, production, distribution. The list goes on and on. The more prosperous you are, the more culture you have, the more liberties you have, the more peace comes, things of that nature. So really what I'm trying to get at is the nation is kind of like a collective consciousness, so to speak, and it really rested on specific developments. The idea that people could read, literacy jumped through the roof, the creation of national schools and armies, the importance, here's one, of natural rituals, voting, holidays, festivals, singing of national anthems, right? These are all really, really recent developments in human history. And what all of these things do. You get a national language. You begin to invent heritages about, well, these people have always been French. They just didn't know it, right? All of these specific developments turn into this whole idea that we are a nation, and we are, well, as the United States, we are American, and Canadians are not, right? They are Canadians. We are Americans, and Mexicans are not. They are from Mexico, right? Just using the United States as an example. So that's what comes with this development of nationalism, is the idea is we are something and everybody else is not. And that's kind of what fuels what we've already talked about, colonization, taking over Africa. They are not French, they are African, those kind of ideas. Which, as you know, in World War I and World War II, those are the very dangerous thoughts and ideas that kind of push all of these countries towards war. Alright, so now we'll talk about the idea of Romanticism, and it really pops up in Germany, with people like Wagner and a lot of people that Kant, but it really was a reaction to the Enlightenment. This is A Wanderer Above the Sea and Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. And it kind of encompasses this romantic movement, which is, we talk about the Enlightenment being all about unemotional reason, maybe not so much attacks against Christianity, but attacks against organized church. But a lot of the people in the Enlightenment did attack faith as well, right? Reason over faith kind of idea, believe in what you can see. And the Romanticism movement is kind of a reaction to that, and this is a very good painting of that. Right? And this is also kind of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution as well, because it's very natural. But here's this guy in nature, and he's above. He's, it's beautiful. He's looking at a mountain, but it's also this idea that, he's only a very small part of what's going on around him, right? And it's supposed to create this emotion from you, this emotion of that the world is bigger than you are kind of idea. It's just this idea of nature, simplicity, feeling. It's not that all questions can be answered, so to speak, but that there is a truth in everything. But it's not that doesn't mean that it's rational. It just means that there are truths. But the thing about this is you can't learn them all because there's just too many of them. So you're going to misunderstand some of them. The reason why it begins in Germany is because of a movement called Pietism, which is basically this idea that all you need is God. This was a very powerful idea at the time in Germany. The Germans also have a very high inferiority complex when dealing with France, because around this time, Germany does not get united until 1870. So by the 1800s, you have Napoleon, right, and he's running through Europe, and Germany is just kind of sitting back and watching. They're not a real nation, so they get this sense of being different and going inside yourself, and the feeling that all things don't make sense, right? Why is France so much more of a nation than us when we are neighbors? And some of the people who lead this search, and it's kind of an interesting idea, this Romanticism, is Johann Hamann. He's kind of Kant's benefactor. Immanuel Kant is a very interesting man. He's very hard to understand, but he does come up with some interesting things every once in a while if you push through a whole bunch of his stuff. Hamann comes up with, he knew the world by faith and language. He says the only way that you can really experience things and come to know things is by talking with people. He says life is not passive, but you need to force yourself on people. You need to force your language. You need to talk with people. Language creates reality, right? Haman says people want to belong to something because we're all human beings. And he says the way that you belong to something is through church and through language, and a common language. Okay, so it's kind of this idea of nationalism, but he's also kind of using this emotional attachment to it. It's not something as rational as a nation. It's something more based upon faith and common language as opposed to other things. After him comes Herder, and he kind of says the same thing. He kind of says humans are expressive, and he kind of piggybacks on Haman and saying human expression, the whole reason for human expression is so that you belong with other human beings, right? He says, but he also says there is no good idea for everyone, and somebody will rebel against it. Okay, so he's romantic in the sense that not everybody has the same feelings about everything. It's not not scientific, it's not rational, but not everybody's going to like the same thing, not everybody's going to like the same people. You know, that's just the way it is. People think with their emotions, people think with their expressions. They don't think as analytically as people in the Enlightenment say they do. Right? We do a lot of dumb things strictly based on emotions. That was Herder's idea. Along with Herder is one of the most famous romantics of the time, and that would be Immanuel Kant. He actually lived quite a long life at the time. Kant was all about self-reflection and looking inwards. He kind of says he kind of comes up with this idea: is you can't be free if you're influenced by outside sources. He's all about the inner moral man and freedom. He says if you can't make choices by yourself, then that's not morality. He says just because society says it's wrong doesn't make it wrong. But he says you are responsible for everything that you do. Okay, he comes up with this long-winded idea about murder, saying, you know, he's saying in some situations killing somebody is right. Even though you'll probably go to jail for it and you'll be convicted of murder, he says if you believe in your heart of hearts that what you did was right, then it was right. Don't let society or anybody outside of you personally tell you that it was wrong, because it wasn't, if you believe it's right. It's all about what you believe and how you feel about it. So you can kind of see how we get the whole idea of what a romantic is today. It's similar, it's not the same thing, but what we think of as romantic, you know, like a romantic comedy or something, right? It's all about feelings and emotions, and that's what these guys are talking about. But these guys are a little more outward and a little bit more about morality as opposed to just, you know, watching a funny romantic comedy kind of idea. Immanuel Kant also comes up with this idea of exploitation. It's this idea of, he says, if you use someone to attain anything in this world, then that is the worst thing that you can do. He says playing yourself as a victim of circumstances is not moral, meaning there is no determinism. So basically what he says is, like in today's standards, it's not what you know, it's who you know. He would say, like getting a job. He says, using your cousin or your best friend because they have a job working at a coffee shop in downtown Moscow and you want a job, asking them to get you a job and to give a reference is the worst thing that you can possibly do for those people, because it's not their job to watch over you, it's your job, and all you're doing is exploiting them. So he comes up with that kind of interesting idea. He's a very individualistic, he's a liberal type of person, right? Everything is about the individual. He also comes up with this thing called the categorical imperative, which is also kind of hard to stand, but it's kind of interesting. He says the golden rule doesn't go far enough. He says you need to universalize your actions. You have to say, if everyone did it, would you like it? So it goes beyond the golden rule, you know, only do what you want others to do to you. You have to think of it in the terms of universalizing it. So for instance, he's not a person. It's kind of more of an evaluation of your motivation, kind of for the actions that you do. I mean, it's not so much a moral yardstick, but it's kind of the idea of, here's an example. If you were late, he says, if you had your choice, all you do is you'd stay at home today and you'd play video games instead of working hard, because that's what humans want to do, right? Or we want to go out and we want to do things that are fun. We don't want to go to our 9-to-5 jobs necessarily every day, right? But he says, you got to think about it. If everyone thought and did that, then there would be no pleasure in it. Because if everyone did it, then nobody would work and then nothing would happen. Right? Then society would crumble. So he says, go to work. Don't be lazy, because you have to universalize it. Okay? You got to think, if everybody was doing this, what would happen? Right? And so that's kind of what the categorical imperative is. It's kind of hard to understand, but it's interesting at the same time. All right, it's very moral, even though he said he didn't like moral yardsticks. Immanuel Kant is very moral about everything, right? It's all about motivation and why you do what you do. And if you do what you do and you think it's right, then it is right. And then also Edmund Burke that we talked about, even though he's British and a conservative, he comes up with this word sublime. And it's kind of a cool idea. It's this whole, what sublime is like this idea of self-preservation, and you feel it most when you're in pain or danger, right? Isn't that the whole, people say human beings in essence are sadistic, right? They don't mind pain. In fact, a lot of people like pain. But he says the sublime is even better when you get this passion without pain or danger, but it's happening to someone else and you're watching it, right? He says that's what's sublime. Sublime. He says being scared is an aesthetic delight, right? So he would obviously enjoy something. An example would be like horror movies today, right? I get too scared at them, but Burke would say that's sublime, and he's the person who comes up with this word sublime is this whole idea about passion and about human beings. They don't mind getting hurt or being in danger, because that's what adrenaline is, right? We're all adrenaline junkies at some point, but when you're watching it, that's even better, and that's sublime, right? So that's Edmund Burke's, and this is also a romantic notion of emotions more than actual, even though Burke was a very, very conservative, rational thinker, he also comes up with this idea of the sublime, which is, when you think about it, that's, humans don't mind seeing other humans in pain as much as they mind having themselves in pain, right? Even though most humans, or a lot of humans, don't mind pain either. And that was Burke's argument. So that's kind of romanticism in a nutshell, with some of the more important German thinkers of the time. Alright, so this slide we're going to talk about Friedrich Hegel and kind of the people who follow him, because you can't understand Karl Marx and communism and this whole movement that comes out of the Industrial Revolution and political thought without understanding Hegel. And then kind of the people who follow him are funny in a sense, and they're what we call utopian socialists, and Marx kind of rips on these guys as well, but they have a lot of the same ideas that he has. Hegel kind of had this Platonic, as in Plato, idea of the world, in the sense that Plato said that the world is nothing but ideas, right? Ideas are out there from God, but somehow God gives them to humans, and humans screw them up. So we have this ideal of something that is perfect, but in reality, and it's all about reality for Hegel, life is not perfect. But Plato and Hegel, and later, much later, Hegel says, but to better understand the truth, you have to know ideas. Okay? So Hegel's one of his main ideas is this idea of the will, which Nietzsche will also use as well. One of Hegel's favorite people is actually Napoleon, and he says the will is something that you have to impose on people, right? And he said Napoleon did that. He bent a whole continent to his will. Napoleon was a man who said, this is how things are going to be done, and he did them. And Hegel says that's what the will is. He says use your ideas, use your will, and you create something. And Hegel's whole idea is reality is what you make it. So you really have to understand this to understand Marx, because that's where Marx gets this idea of reality. Because really, what is important is the reality. There are no abstracts. Humans are what they do. They're what they build. And Hegel was a Christian. Marx would be very atheist, but Hegel kind of surrounds all of these ideas with God's will and things like that. It's kind of hard to understand, but and at the same time, that's what the will is. He's saying make the reality yours, and he emphasizes history very, very much. He says history is the realization of reason, meaning reality, which is made by God in nature, is kind of what history is, and we can only understand that by studying it. It can be deciphered, it can be understood. He says it's mysterious and it's really big, but we can step back from history, learn about it, develop from it, and begin to see it. And he says if you can study history, then you can maybe learn a few things about the future. He says, for instance, we used to ask what the sun was, but now we understand what it is, right? That kind of idea. And he also Hegel has this idea that at some point the world will be a utopia of sorts. And the way Hegel says, the way to get this is through a state. And a state, to him, is a community plus family for the betterment of all. Meaning we are all participating in this idea of the state. So really he says, what's important is to have a family unit, and then you can put a whole bunch of these family units together and they'll create a state. And he says that's kind of what utopia is going to be like. Okay, this is what Hegel's idea. And then there's the church and other things. They're all wrapped in one, but those are the basic ideas from Hegel. What also is important from Hegel is he comes up with the idea of a dialectic, which Marx will obviously use, and we'll talk more about Marx. It's the basic thesis is the idea or the event that occurred, and the antithesis is the rebellion or the things that don't like it. And out of the thesis and the antithesis, you get a synthesis. But at the same time, all of this creates a better understanding of the universe, which was Hegel's whole idea. So, for instance, here's one from Marx. The Industrial Revolution is the thesis. So think of it as like a bracket, NCAA March Madness bracket. So at the top of the bracket, you have the Industrial Revolution. On the bottom bracket, you have the antithesis, or what happened because of the revolution, the Industrial Revolution. You can put poverty, complete misery, pollution, everything that's bad from the Industrial Revolution, you can put underneath the Industrial Revolution. And then if you move, and then if you're looking at the top and the bottom, and what comes out of the top and the bottom will be socialism. Will become this idea that Marx brings up, that from the Industrial Revolution you get poverty and you get misery, and from those two things together you get this idea of a worker's paradise, and you get the idea that people need to get paid better wages in this idea. It's kind of an abstract way of thinking about things. Another one would be out of the French Revolution. If the French Revolution is on top, That's the thesis. The antithesis would be just the murder and the mayhem that ensued out of the next, from the start of the French Revolution to the end of the Reign of Terror. And then out of that thesis and antithesis, the synthesis would be you get Napoleon, right? People were tired of the murder and the mayhem, and so Napoleon comes along, and he's the synthesis of those two things, right? He's the outcome. And then you can, and Hegel says that's how history is based. You have an event, you have a reaction to the event, and then you get the synthesis of it. It's easier if you can draw it out, but I hope you guys understand that. So that was the dialectic, and that was Hegel's idea, how Hegel interpreted history, and that's exactly how Karl Marx is going to interpret history. He's going to come up with a thing called dialectic materialism, which we'll talk about. And like I also said, Hegel was a Christian, so this whole idea is he thinks that the whole idea for human endeavors is to become closer to God and understand God. Okay, so he leaves out a lot of injustices that happen in the world, and so that's what these young Hegelians pick up from Hegel. They kind of use him, but then they kind of start turning it into a political theory. They argue that all history is people fighting for property and capital, right? So Marx will become more of a young Hegelian than a Hegel himself. They say, yeah, we understand what you're talking about, but you can't leave out all of the injustices in the world. It's all about property and capital, and who has it and who doesn't. Also out of Hegel, you get this guy named Saint-Simon, and these guys are utopian socialists. Saint-Simon tried to make a technocracy, and all these people are looking for how to make the world a utopia, right? A perfect place. That was Hegel's whole idea. How can humans make a perfect earth? And Saint-Simon says, well, we need to make a technocracy, which is the idea of everything is based on merit. So you get into this community, and then you get these people together who are ruled by the best scientific minds that you can get, right? Ruled by engineers, people like that, scientists, natural scientists, things like that. So his whole idea was this competition with cooperation idea. And the interesting thing about Saint-Simon is he comes up with this, he's the first person to come up with the idea of free love. And not in the hippie sense of the word free love, not 1960s free love. Saint-Simon's whole idea is that history is conflict because of resources, but it's also a conflict because people are aggressive towards one another, and people are always mad because of how humans view sexuality. And he says the reason why everybody walks around pissed off is because everybody's married to people they don't love, right? He says all of these arranged marriages, a woman getting pregnant, so she has to marry the guy who got her pregnant, that whole idea. He says when you have marriages that are not based on love, then your lust is not being fulfilled. So his idea of free love was you choose who you want to marry, and he actually pioneered the idea of having rewarding sex with your partner, actually being attracted to the person you're married to, right? Physically, right? And this shocked a lot of people, but that was his whole idea. Is the reason why the world is going to hell in a handbasket is because we're fighting over resources, and the reason why we're fighting is because everybody's sexually repressed. But he doesn't say that means you can go out and just have sex with anybody you want to. He says when you get married, actually like the person, find them attractive, him or her attractive, and love them. Right? So he's a utopian socialist, and also this guy named Charles Fourier is also a utopian socialist, and he was a real hippie. He wanted to create these things called a phalanx, and this is the thing on the right here. And it's kind of a society where you'd get 15 to 1800 people tops, and you would create this kind of enclosed farm, very cultish, right? What people, weirdos do today in like Texas and Arizona, right? They kind of create their own little communities. He says, we're all going to live in this community. We're going to abolish wages. You're going to have organized child care, household labor. Technology was bad and it alienated humans. It's oppressive. But what we can do is build these farm communes. And you get specific people who know how to do a job. So you get all of these people together and they each have a job to do. And actually, a guy by the last names of Owens takes this idea and he sets up some of them in farm communes in Indiana, Texas, and New York. Fourier's idea is that poverty and not inequality was the reason for why this whole idea, why the world isn't going the way that we want it to. So, and he says the whole idea is that people aren't going to work unless they get paid right, and it's very Marxist in that idea. And then also at the same time, Fourier, it was what we would think of as a commune, right? People can have sex with whoever they want. There's no marriages. There's no wages, things like that. If any of you have seen Spinal Tap, they sing a song about it, working on a sex farm, trying to grow some hard love, right? They're making fun of these Fourier kind of idea of just this is the idea of free love, but within a confined 15 to 1800 people-sized community. So these are the utopian socialists, but the whole idea is that they're looking for a way to make the world better, okay? And they come up with ideas and they actually go with it. So I mean, you got to give them credit for that. They just didn't stick so much. But really, bottom line, Karl Marx probably, if not one of the most important thinkers of the 19th century, he hates all these people because he says the people at the top aren't going to give their power away. You can't do it by having sex farms and creating technocracy of 1,000 people, because he says there's more people on that live in the earth than that, right? But he says what you can do is you can create something based scientifically. He says socialism is like gravity. It's going to occur and there are laws to it. He says, just like Hegel, he says history has stages, but these stages are all about the class struggle. He says everything based in history, every war, every bad thing that's ever happened is because somebody was being oppressed. The upper class was oppressing the lower class, and that's how wars begin. He says, ever since the world market opened, merchants get the money, and when merchants get the money, they make the rules, they make the policies, they create new governments, and then new governments create capitalism. And then once you get money and you get what's capitalism, he actually says, that's sex appeal, right? Capitalism is all about money, and the more money you have, the sexier you are. And he says, that's even though he wasn't a Christian, he says, that's not God's plans, right? He says that's not the way things should be, but it's the way they have been, and Marx says, I'm going to set out to change that. Alright, so the mural on the right is actually a Diego Rivera mural, and he was a famous Mexican muralist in the 1920s. In fact, he personally hid Leon Trotsky when Trotsky gets sent out of when he has to flee Russia from Joseph Stalin. Eventually ends up with an ice pick in his head. But anyways, it's kind of funny because Diego Rivera was a staunch communist socialist, and but he was commissioned by Henry Ford's son to paint murals in Detroit, which is kind of funny, right? The capital of capitalism in the United States, and the person who painted, this is in the Detroit Institute of Art now, but at one time, it was painted by Diego Rivera. So kind of trick of history there. That's kind of interesting, right? The number one capitalist in the world asking a communist to paint for him, and he does, and this is called Detroit Industry. If you're interested in what Diego Rivera painted, just type in Mexican muralists or Rivera murals. I mean, he did a lot. Very famous, very important pieces of art, and very well done too. Took a long time. So we get to Karl Marx now. He takes Hegel and he creates this idea called dialectical materialism, and he comes up with this whole idea that a negation of a negation is a good thing. Will leave only good things, right? He takes dialectics from Hegel and he applies them to capitalism. He says there's just too many social problems in the world and governments are going to collapse. He says capitalism is a seed, just like any other seed. It'll grow and then eventually it'll die and it'll wither out, and what will be left of it is communism. And communism is the exact opposite of capitalism, right? So he says, he takes Hegel and that's what dialectical materialism is. He says capitalism grows, all the bad things that happen with capitalism are the antithesis, and the synthesis is going to be communism. And then he also comes up with this idea of historical materialism. He says, here's how history goes. He said history is in basically 3 stages. You had slaves. It's gone through 3 stages. There's going to be 4 stages. He said you had societies that were based on slaves. You had the Roman Empire. You had all of the empires throughout the world, before feudalism, and they were completely based on slave labor. He says then, out of that, the antithesis to that would be feudalism, right? So then you get the idea of not everybody's this, then you get the idea of landowners, and you get the idea that they have serfs working for them, so they're not necessarily slaves. Most of them were, but they also, some of them also got to keep some of the crops that they were keeping, right? Things like that. They had houses. They got to keep some of their crops. They could pay mortgages that way. Things like that. Maybe some of them even owned a little bit of land for themselves, kind of idea, right? So they kind of changed from the slave societies and all of those empires fell. And then you got feudalism, and then he says feudalism didn't work, and what replaced feudalism was capitalism. And he says that's the 3rd stage, that's the stage that we're in now. And he says at some point capitalism is going to fall, and it has to go somewhere else. Capitalism isn't going to rule the world forever. And he says where it's going to go is it's going to go to communism. Alright, so that's the idea of historical materialism. That's also kind of connected with dialectical materialism. And he says, like we talked about the last slide, it's all about class. It's those who have the resources and those who don't. That's what history is. And it's all about where you are in the process of making things, right? Where you are in the job is where you are in the creating process is your job. He says what people need to do is we need to get together, we need to have the same goals, and you get together in a commune or a community and you act on common interests, right? And he says that's what people need to do, because what's happening in history is those who win are making history, and the people who are winning right now were the landowners, were the slave owners, and now they're the factory owners. He says we're just replacing owners with different owners, and he says that needs to stop. All right. And so he comes up with this model. It's kind of hard to, it's an abstract, but he says here's how the world goes. He says there's a base, and this is society organizing, and this is the production process, or as Hegel would call it, the reality. He says this is the material reality at the base, and this is what is really happening. He says above the base, maybe you could look at it as a snow globe or something like that. That you have the base, and that's the reality. And above that you have ideas, and you have art, and religion, and politics. And Marx says all of that stuff is worthless. Those are ideologies, right? Those are how we view the world through our own moral judgments. And he says, all of that stuff, art, religion, politics, ideas, those are worthless. He says the people who are powerful are the ones who create their own reality, right? Very Hegel-like. He says, all ideas are illusions. And he says, what is driving history is reality. And he says the reality, which he takes from young Hegelians, is money. Money is the reality. That's what drives everything, right? Everybody does everything for money. Because in essence, he says, human beings want to work, right? That's the bottom line, is nobody's so lazy that they just want to sit around all day, every day. Nobody can do that. He says the bottom line is people have to work, and they want to work, but they want to be treated fairly. Okay? So he also comes up with this labor theory of value. All of these things that he comes up with are kind of commonsensical to us now, but Marx is really one of the first guys who really puts all of this into a theory. And this labor theory of value is probably the most controversial at the time. He says there's a difference between the true and the real value. Or I'm sorry, they're the same. What is the true value is the real value of things. So he says what these are is the cost of materials and the labor of making this commodity. He says then you get the surplus, which is the profit. And he says in the world today, only capitalists are getting this. So this is when he says what you need to do, or like the profit is being expropriated from the laborers, and the people who are making it are the ones who should profit from it. So this is where he comes up with the idea of expropriating from the expropriators. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but that's what comes out of this labor theory of value. Here, I'll use an example. First, let's say a DVD in today's society. Probably a DVD may cost 5 cents to make, you know, maybe $1 at most to wrap it, to ship it, and to sell it. But it's sold for $16, I don't know, maybe even $20 today, right? And so Marx says, where does that $19 go from the cost of it, the cost of shipping it, and the cost of putting it on the shelf? And then all of a sudden, you know, you've multiplied by 20 times how much it's worth. And Marx says, I know where this money goes. It goes to the company and the middlemen. And he says, what the people who actually make the product need to do is just take that money because it's theirs. Right? It's not the people who shipped it. They should get a little bit of it. It's not the people who sold it. They should get a little bit of it too. And it's not the factory owners. It's the people who's made it. All right. So that's very controversial at the time, and it's probably kind of controversial today, right? This whole idea of minimum wage, things like that. He also comes up with this idea of fetish, and he says basically that's what commodities are, is they're a fetish. He says the implication is that if you understand how everything is made and the cost of things, then it won't hold the power over you. He says, even in the 1800s, he's saying, look at society. All people care about is what they have, right? And he says, but if you understood how it was made, you wouldn't want it anymore, right? It's the whole, the whole McDonald's idea, I can't remember the name of the book now. I've read it, but if you really understood what was going into your cheeseburger that you were eating at McDonald's or Wendy's, then you wouldn't eat it, right? That's Marx's idea, and that's the idea of a fetish. He says, would you still want it? But he says we choose not to think about that because we do want it, because it's a fetish, because commodities have a power over us. Right. That's kind of Karl Marx's idea, which is an interesting idea. Okay. He also says basically what human beings want is justice. Right. I just said. He says humans do want to work, but when they do work, they want to be paid fairly. They want to have dignity, and they want to have respect. He says every human being puts pride and effort into their job, and we want it to be as good as we can be. Making things takes time, it takes money, and it used to take love. But then we got factories and we got mass production, and all of these things go out the window, right? He says people start thinking that a chair is only a chair, so then I have to start cutting corners and I have to start lowering prices, and so you start losing pay and you start losing dignity and you start to hate your job. And he says, and even though you're a chair maker and it used to take you 2 weeks to make a wooden chair, to engrave it, to shape it, to you put your heart and soul, right? You know, instead of working in a factory, you had your own shop, and you created this chair from a piece of wood, and it probably took you 2 weeks. It may have even taken you a month. But then you went to the market and you sold it at a fair price, and people bought it because you made it nice, and that made you proud, and that made you dignified. And even though, and you were a chair maker, and that's what you were known for. But then Mark says, then the factories come, and then people don't have time, and they don't want to spend money on chairs. They just want a chair, a mass-produced chair. So then a chair just becomes a chair, and you lose the pay, you lose the dignity, and you lose respect. And he says, when that happens, that's when people feel alienated. And that is the true definition of alienation, is to Marx, is it's not able to enjoy what you love and identify with, right? You used to love and identify with making chairs. But when your livelihood is taken away from you and you have to start cutting corners, that's when you get the aggressive hatred like nothing else you can feel in this world, right? And at some point you will realize this, and alienation will lead to bad work, and it affects your whole life. And he says, then you start becoming mad at your wife. You start getting mad at your kids, right? You start kicking your dog, things like that. He says that's true alienation, is when everything you've worked hard for and you've identified with your whole life is taken away from you, and it all stems from work, and it all stems from capitalism, right? And he says the only thing you can do is destroy capitalism, right? And he says you can't perhaps change the idea of Walmart in a day, but you can try to destroy it in little bits and pieces. You can stop the exploitation, and you can stop mass producing things, and you can do it to your own needs and your own ability. He says it's going to take time. History takes time. But he said at some point, in slow increments, through historical dialectics, through thesis and antithesis into a synthesis, the world is going to change, and what's going to come out of capitalism is communism. In fact, Marx says you need capitalism for communism because it's historically inevitable, right? You need workers to create a society where every worker is treated equal, and every worker gets the pay that they deserve, the dignity that they deserve for working hard, and the respect that they deserve. Okay, so that's Karl Marx's idea. And he says the way to do that is to become a community, right? And stop mass producing things. So that's Karl Marx in a nutshell. There's other things, if you're interested, you can look online, but those are the basics that will move, that will completely change the world in the 20th century. Okay, so lastly, we'll just quickly touch on Nietzsche, and then we will be done with PowerPoints for this module. Nietzsche is kind of one of those guys that everyone tries to analyze and interpret, but no one really knows, exactly what he was trying to say. A good example of this is his idea of, he's the guy who's known for saying God is dead. But a lot of people don't use his next sentences, and we have killed him. What a lot of people interpret this as is that the Christian faith, as was practiced in his time, was not a proper representation of Jesus' teachings, right? It was people were being forced to believe in the way of Jesus, but nobody acted like him, right? Nobody was treating each other well, or based on the teachings of Jesus. And he says, most in particularly in the example of refusing to judge people, right? He says that's something that Christians are constantly doing the opposite of, right? Telling people what to do, kind of idea. So he also at the time condemned institutionalized Christianity for what he called emphasizing a morality of pity, which means that it assumes that there's an inherent illness in society, but it also means that if you pity somebody, that means that you're emphasizing how much better you are than them, right? Pity is kind of you looking down upon somebody saying, geez, I feel bad for you because you're not me, right? Or you don't have the things that I have, or the group dynamic that I have, whatever. And Nietzsche says that's what's happening. He's saying when he's saying God is dead and we have killed him, a lot of people argue what he's saying is that the developments in modern science and the secularization of European society, starting with the Enlightenment and moving through the 1800s into the late 1800s, had basically killed the Abrahamic God, who had served for the basis for meaning and value in the West for, almost 2,000 years up to that point. Okay, so, and he says, the reason why God is dead is because Europeans have killed him because they just aren't good Christians anymore. They're not following the way of the Bible. They've created this empire, so to speak, of just harsh judgment and falseness, right? And a lot of that is based on what Marx talks about as like class and money, and the idea that everybody thinks they're better than somebody else or wants to be, and everybody's judging everybody. And he says what this has done is it's leading to this outright nihilism. And nihilism, like really in the Big Lebowski sense, is the belief that nothing has any inherent importance and that life itself lacks purpose, right? Nihilism is like you believe in nothing. And he says, and even though Nietzsche is not a Christian by any sense of the word, in fact, he's probably more of an atheist than he is a spiritual man, spiritual in the Christianity sense, is that he says Christianity and the morality that it taught, used to teach, had intrinsic value to it, right? A belief in God, which justifies the evil in the world, it creates an intrinsic value for good, right? You people can understand that, and that makes your life important, right? Knowing that life is worth something and believing in something, even if perhaps it's a monotheistic God that I personally don't believe in. But he says what pushed Europe to the greatest heights it's ever been is this whole idea of Christianity and its intrinsic value. And he says by the end of the 19th century, Europeans had lost that. Right? So that's what that God is dead idea, that's what a lot of people think it means. Although at the same time it could just mean exactly what he said it means, right? God is dead and we've killed him in the sense that as the world is secularizing, there is no place for him or her in the world anymore, right? We're past that. We need to move on to better things. I don't know what he was specifically trying to say, but those are two ideas that people float around. Kind of coming off of Hegel as well, Nietzsche comes up with this idea of will to power, and it's kind of a response to Darwinism and utilitarianism, and utilitarianism argues that people strive to be happy and attain things, and that is why they live their lives. That is why human beings live, is because to, to attain more things, right? Darwin explains it as a struggle for survival, right? But opposed to this idea is Nietzsche's will to power, which basically can be understood to mean like a struggle against one's surroundings that culminates in personal growth, self-overcoming. You're going to create a perfect self, and you're going to assert that power, and you're going to hold power over others. That's kind of the result of it. But the result of it is coincidental, right? This is where we get the term Übermensch, which means overman. And this is the reason why people in World War I in Germany, and then especially World War II, they cling to this idea of will to power. It's that you need to will yourself to become a better person, and when you do that, you will assert power over people, and you won't even try to. People will realize that you're better than them, and they will follow you. And he says, when you become perfect, then when you have the power over everyone, it's just a coincidence. That's what the Übermensch means. Kind of overman. That's the literal translation, but it'll be used, kind of like a Superman type of being. And Nietzsche says you can will that. You can do that. Very Hegelian, right? You create your own reality. And Nietzsche goes farther and says you can do that, and then when you do, people will listen to what you say, right? So you can see how the Nazis love this idea. Nietzsche comes also up with this really cool idea called eternal recurrence. And what this is, well, he calls the idea horrifying and paralyzing, right? But he says, if you ever wish for eternal recurrence, that marks the ultimate affirmation of your life. And the basic idea of eternal recurrence is this, and this is kind of the beginning of one of my favorite books of all time, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. If you're interested in this idea, this is kind of how this book starts out. So Nietzsche says, if, let's say one day you're sitting at your house and a demon comes and says to you, you are going to live your life over and over again, but nothing is going to change, right? Every loneliness, every good time, every bad time, every time you were scared, every time you were happy. Every choice you made in your first life, you're just going to keep making the same choice. Nothing will change over and over and over and over again. Kind immemorial. And then he asked the question, Nietzsche asked the question, would you be afraid of this and say, no, please don't do this, whatever you do? Or would you say, okay, I can do that. I would live my same life over and over and over again. And Nietzsche says, if you have experienced a tremendous moment, here his quote is, have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered to him, you are a God, and never have I heard anything more divine. Right? He says that's kind of also this whole idea of an Übermensch is this idea that have you lived your life and you've loved your life so much that you repeat it over and over again. And he says when you can say yes to that, that means that you have lived your life how you want to live, or something has happened in your life where you've said everything that was terrible and awful before, it's worth it because it's got to this point. And for Nietzsche, it was when he went on a hike and he was overlooking kind of like that painting that we saw earlier by Friedrich, that kind of is a Nietzschean kind of painting. He says I can't even remember what the mountain was, but he got to the top of it and he said, okay, this is the reason why I've lived my life, to be at this moment. For others it could be meeting your spouse or, having your first child, whatever it is. He just says, if there is a moment, and you'll know it when you have it, and something happens in your life where you say, okay, it was all worth it, he said, then you've lived the right life, no matter what's happened before or after. And what goes with that is his idea of amor fati, which basically means the love of fate. It says that is the formula for human greatness. He says that one, when you want nothing different, nothing forward, nothing backward, everything the same in all its entirety for eternity, and you actually love it, then that means that you have lived a good life, right? And you have become an overman, and there's a possibility that you have power over people and you don't even know it, and it's coincidental. So those are a few of the things that Nietzsche talks about. He's one of my favorites, even though, some people can't really, a lot of people say you don't really know what he's saying. Even if you don't, these kind of ideas like eternal recurrence is pretty straightforward, and amor fati and this will to power is pretty straightforward, right? So I really like those ideas, but some of these ideas will come back. We'll see. Of all of these isms, though, probably the two ones that will have the most effect on the 20th century and into the 21st century will be nationalism and communism or socialism. So that is the PowerPoint for this week.